And welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today we'll be looking at a piece by a composer whose musical language poses significant problems to students and professionals alike. In the traditional piano canon, Gabriel Fauré is perhaps treated as the most abstract of the French Romantic composers, and in this vein he is certainly not performed nearly as often as Ravel or Debussy. Granted, his output for solo piano is smaller in number, but in my experience, his pieces seem to pose serious interpretational problems for performers. A common complaint I've heard is, I just can't make this piece work. And this simple phrase actually encompasses a wealth of concerns. So, on this episode, we're going to look into the beautiful difficulties Fauré can pose. Fauré's nocturnes span a rather large sector of his total musical output, ranging from Opus 33 to Opus 119 over 50 years. These pieces show many different facets of his compositional language as he continued to develop his aesthetic. In this episode, we're going to start by looking at his first nocturne. In some ways, his musical language is conventional to the late 19th century. The tonic key of E-flat minor is established and reinforced early. The main cadences are in fact dominant tonic cadences, though the arrival on the dominant is somewhat unusual. Even the layout and distribution of melody over harmony is conventional, with the melody on top and the harmony on the bottom, combined with a simple rhythm that isn't in any way complex or unusual. Given this information, the obvious point of interest becomes the harmonic progressions that are conventional and unusual at the same time. Here's what I'm talking about. The first two bars are within the bounds of E flat minor. Once we hit the third bar, things take an odd turn. This is normalized again in bar 4, quickly enough not to shake anyone out of their seat. What you essentially have is a progression that relies upon the changing of single notes away from E flat minor, which gives the impression of a conventional harmonic situation, but slightly twisted or more painful than if we stayed completely in E flat minor. Already in this bar, we encounter one of the first major problems that we face in Fauré. In order to look into it in more depth, I'd like to set a bit of a foundation first. When we construct our interpretation, we essentially pick and choose elements of the piece that we feel are important, not necessarily to us, but to the composer and what we think they're trying to express. This is why there is so much variation in performance, and the more abstract a piece is, usually the more interpretational options one has. Bach, as an example, can be performed for the most part in any way, shape, or form, transcribed to any instrument or vocal combination at any speed or tempo, whereas a Chopin Polonaise usually fails miserably if removed from the pianist realm or if the rhythmic structure is loosened. When a composer like Fauré in this historical period uses a simple rhythm and simple voicing distribution, the assumption as a performer is that the harmony is the element that deserves the most attention and is what should be highlighted to the audience due to its uniqueness or variety. This highlighting is traditionally accomplished through sound color changes and timing elements like rubato. Knowing this, let's get back to the Nocturne and consider why this seemingly simple yet complex bar can be a problem for a pianist. When we deconstruct this situation, we have a melody over harmony. Let's say we want to highlight the melody with a singing tone and keep the harmony as played in the chords underneath supportive but unobtrusive. For the first two bars, it's not a problem. When we get to the third bar, we run into Fauré's unusual harmonic progression. If we play it as we did the first two bars, then the progression can sound like a mistake. Listen to it in context. Given this kind of change, the natural thought of the pianist is, well, I have to make this change in harmony somewhat special, or at least point it out to the audience so they have time to process it. The score is very specific regarding the use of dynamics and articulation, so we can really only adjust our sound quality and timing to cause a musical effect. Do we highlight the harmony using a change of sound quality, like this? Do we highlight the harmony using a change in timing, kind of rubato? Do we play it as a combination of the two? In a different context, perhaps some of these could work. But Fauré provides additional elements to his composition that make these solutions nearly impossible. This nocturne is mostly continuous in rhythmic regularity. It's not at all like Debussy or Chopin, but more along the lines of Bach and Ravel. Because of this, the element of timing change or rubato appears very obvious to an audience if we apply it. In other words, everything is going along steady, and then for no structural reason apparent to the audience, the pianist suddenly slows down. Worse off, the harmonic changes that we are highlighting occur in the middle of phrases, not at the ends where time can be taken a little more naturally. So, rubato of any sort other than subtle is really off the table. We could get away with something like this. But again, we run the risk of upsetting the continuous rhythm to a point where it sounds unnatural or forced. The continuous phrase and line of the melody also act as a deterrent for change, this time in sound quality. The melody is thus. To do any serious change in sound quality in the middle of the line breaks the line, which is the last thing we want to do when trying to convey a long melody. It compartmentalizes something that is supposed to be the opposite of the already compartmentalized accompaniment, harmony, and rhythm. Like the issue with rubato, we could do a subtle shift in sound, but this still risks shortening the line, which goes against the aesthetic purpose. So, what can we do? We can't play it straight, or else it can sound jarring and strange to the audience. We can't change our dynamics or articulation, as that would conflict with what's written by Fauré. If we take time or add rubato, we destroy the effect of continuous movement as set up by the accompaniment and texture. And if we change our sound quality, we end up cutting the melodic line into segments, which will sabotage the illusion of a long line and the creative juxtaposition Fauré creates between melody and accompaniment. In essence, every traditional technique we have at our disposal as pianists is restricted by something written into the piece. And unfortunately, this means that anything we choose to do comes at the cost of Fauré's music. We encounter the same problem at the final cadence in this section. There is still a dominant to tonic progression right at the end. But how Fauré gets there is not really predictable. Given that this situation is similar to the first, is there anything we can do to ease the audience into this? Well, first off, let's consider it from the point of view of the voice leading, as this is what makes this progression sound so odd. The top voice, if played with simplified block chords underneath, could sound like this. Aside from the F flat, which is a product of chromatic movement, the melody is reasonably natural in its movement. The bass voice acts the same way. If played with simplified chords, it sounds reasonable, aside from the B double flat, which is again a product of chromatic movement. What forces a strangeness into this section is that not all voices are moving chromatically. The inner two voices move according to the key of E flat minor, with a slight alteration in the F flat to prevent a severe crush of sound. The juxtaposition of chromatic movement with diatonic movement is what causes the progression to sound odd to our ears. Consider what it sounds like without the top melody. Does this give us a clue as to how to approach it? I believe so. The choice in terms of what we highlight to an audience resides in what elements are difficult to follow and what are easy. Obviously, the melody will be first, no matter what, and the bass will come in as a close second. Now, do we make more of the inner top voice, which is rather stable? Or do we make more of the inner bottom voice, which is moving with the bottom bass, but as a contradiction in that it moves diatonically as opposed to chromatically? If I want the audience to feel comfortable, I'd probably focus more on the inner bottom voice. When played a little more prominently, it serves as an acoustical stabilizer within the key of E flat minor. The reason for this is because the second chord of bar 16 can be heard as a B minor 7th chord. This severely distracts the ear in the progression, because the chord is stable enough that it can be seen as an endpoint rather than something that we just play through. In order to hear it as a progression towards the tonic, we have to emphasize the voices that reinforce the key of E flat minor and not any other key. And this is why we go with the inner bottom voice. If we are interested in showing the audience the strangeness of the progression, we simply do the opposite. Instead of emphasizing the inner bottom voice, we emphasize the chromatic movement in the lower bass voice as an extension of the chromatic movement that is started in the melody. This makes the whole thing sound like a snake slithering through keys, but without any firm foundation. Can this approach be applied to the problem in the opening of the piece? I think so. Once again, let's set the voicing hierarchy. The top melody first, and the bass second. The top melody is fully diatonic, whereas the bottom voice is chromatic for a moment. Now, let's look at the inner voices. Notice that the reverse is happening. The top inner voice is chromatic. And the lower inner voice is diatonic. Using the same strategy, if we want the progression to sound more comfortable to an audience, then we exaggerate the elements that are diatonic, so the melody and the lower inner voice. If we want the progression to sound strange and odd, exaggerate the elements that are chromatic. But you see, we have the control now to adjust the progression to be as noticeable or unobtrusive as we want, depending on what we think our audience can handle. At the beginning of the episode, I mentioned different ways that we traditionally differentiate unpredictable or strange harmonies, using sound quality change or rubato. These techniques are used widely in music from the Romantic era, and understandably so. They are very useful and effective if applied to the right music. Furthermore, these techniques emphasize to the audience that a strange chord has an emotional function, a function that is more about the here and now rather than as part of a larger whole. Using voicing alterations to adjust the audience experience of unusual chords is a much rarer occurrence in this style of music, but it seems that this technique is absolutely necessary in Fauré, and more so in his later works when he really jumps off the deep end of harmonic stability. What I think is happening with Fauré is that he is using chord progressions which he might consider to be normal in his musical language. That these are not strange events with any special meaning to be pointed out to the audience, but merely different or untried paths to a familiar destination. The destination is what is important, and Fauré's aesthetic stability supports this belief. Obviously, I could have said at the beginning of this episode that voicing is the answer. However, this statement is useless if we don't understand why the other options can be problematic or less effective. When we are faced with chord progressions which are unusual, the first thought that goes through a general audience is whether or not the note was played deliberately by the pianist. This is inescapable unless you're performing to an audience that frequents concerts of contemporary music and is used to taking performances at face value, rather than as a comparison to something they've heard before. There is, of course, the added feature of our own performance skill set, that of making everything on stage look to the audience as being deliberate, even if it is a mistake. This is why we fall into the trap with Fauré. We think that a strange harmony has a musical effect function, simply because the majority of classical and romantic pieces use strange harmonies in this way. In our attempt to maintain the illusion that we're in control of all of this, we make an effect out of it in order to show that we know all. Fauré is a complex composer, and we'll definitely be returning to him. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and keep an eye out for situations like this when playing Fauré. You're guaranteed to find many of them. Bye for now.